You ever watch someone walk into a building they've never set foot in, look around at a machine that's been running flawlessly for over a decade, and go, yeah, I can see at least three things we don't need here anymore. And they start pulling wires, and everyone who actually knows what the wires do just watches? That energy. That is the story. Stay to the end for my take and drop yours in the comments because I already know this one's gonna split the room. I can tell you the exact loss ratio on a Florida wind-only book from 2017 without opening a file, not because I memorized it, because I lived inside that number for 6 months while I restructured the catastrophe excess of loss program around it. My name is Stephanie Hargrove, and for 11 years I was the lead treaty underwriter at Clarendon Ray, a Hartford-based reinsurance subsidiary owned by a European group called Veritas International. My job, reduced to its simplest form, was deciding how much risk we kept and how much we gave away. But that description is like saying a surgeon just cuts things. I built Clarendon's catastrophe program from scratch. Every attachment point, every reinstatement provision, every sliding scale commission schedule on our top 40 treaties passed through my hands. I knew which cedents were overcounting their probable maximum loss estimates and which ones were sandbagging. I knew our Gulf Coast property book had a sublimit correlation problem that only surfaced when you ran storm surge layered over inland flood, and I had spent 3 years convincing our retrocessionaires to price around it. The piece no one else touched was the retrocession program. Retrocession is reinsurance for reinsurers. The layer behind the layer. Ours ran through Lloyd's Syndicate 4471, and the lead underwriter, there was a man named Malcolm Price. Malcolm and I had built a handshake arrangement over 7 years. Every January, I flew to London, sat in his office at the Lloyd's building, and we confirmed a retrocession override clause that capped our net retained exposure during stacked Atlantic hurricane events. The clause lived in a side letter, not in the standard treaty wording. I kept the original in my filing cabinet, third drawer, manila folder labeled 4471 Annual. It renewed on my verbal confirmation and Malcolm's word. The new year started with a rumor. Someone from outside the industry was being brought in at the C-suite level, a chief revenue officer. I had never heard of a reinsurance carrier needing a chief revenue officer. That should have been the first sign. But I was too busy running models on a North Atlantic season that was already looking warm. Colton Brierly arrived in March wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage and a smile optimized for pitch decks. He came from a management consulting firm, not McKinsey, but close enough to borrow the vocabulary. The European parent board hired him to, and I am quoting the internal memo, architect a growth-aligned revenue strategy for Clarendon's North American platform. I read that sentence 4 times. It never meant anything. His first week, he scheduled a value chain mapping session with every department head. I sat in a glass conference room while he drew circles connected by arrows on a whiteboard and used the word ecosystem 11 times. I counted. When he got to underwriting, he pointed at my name on the org chart and said, "This is where we delayer. One person holding institutional knowledge is a single point of failure. We need to operationalize this into a scalable framework." I said, "The retrocession program renews in January through a direct relationship with Lloyd's Syndicate 4471. The override clause on our net retained CAT exposure is a verbal confirmation with their lead underwriter. It requires my physical presence in London. He stared at me. Then he said, "We need to move past handshake-dependent vendor touchpoints and build a digitally enabled relationship management system." He did not understand a single word I had said. Not the retrocession, not the override, not the clause. He heard vendor and travel and decided he had enough information. Over the next 2 months, Colton dismantled things he could not see. He killed the London travel budget. No demonstrable ROI on in-person touchpoints. He restructured underwriting into revenue-aligned pods, which meant 3 junior analysts were now supposed to cover what I had done alone. He brought in a consulting associate from his old firm to audit workflow redundancies. She was 26 and had never seen a treaty contract. Our best senior analyst, Diane Kessler, left in April. She told me over coffee that she had watched Colton present her catastrophe model to the board with the wrong attachment points, and no one corrected him because no one else knew what attachment points were. "He is going to burn this place down," she said. The first time I met him was not in the conference room. It was in the parking garage, his first morning. I was walking in carrying my briefcase, wearing the same navy blazer I always wore. He was standing next to a silver Bentley Continental, phone in one hand, keys in the other. He did not look up. He held the keys out and said, "Front row, don't scratch it." The marble floor made the keys echo when I did not take them. I said, "I'm the lead treaty underwriter. You'll want the valet stand by the west entrance." He laughed, short, automatic, the kind of laugh that is not an apology. Then he walked inside. That was the man who was going to decide what Clarendon needed. It happened in June, a Thursday. Colton's office smelled like espresso and new leather. He had redecorated. "Stephanie, I want to be transparent about where we're heading," he said. He was leaning back in his chair, one ankle crossed over his knee. "We've been doing a holistic review of headcount allocation against revenue-generating bandwidth, and the data is telling us we need to reallocate resources toward a more growth-aligned talent architecture." I waited. He waited. I think he expected me to translate that for myself. "You're eliminating my position," I said. "We're restructuring the function. Your institutional knowledge is valued, but the go-forward model requires a more distributed capability set." I nodded. "I understand." He blinked. I watched his posture shift. He had been bracing for a fight, and the absence of one left him off balance, like a man leaning into a door that opens the other way. "We'll provide a generous transition package, of course, 60 days. "That's very fair," I said. I smiled. Not wide. Just enough. He looked at the corner of his desk. I went back to my office and packed in 2 hours. I forwarded personal correspondence to my home email. I saved my contact list. I pulled the manila folder from the third drawer, the one labeled 4471, annual, and placed it in my briefcase. That was mine. 7 years of relationship, confirmed by handshake. The side letter existed because Malcolm Price trusted me, not Clarendon. The security guard walked me to the lobby. The marble floor was cold and bright. I sat in my car for 2 minutes. I did not cry. I called Malcolm Price in London and told him I was no longer with Clarendon. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Well, They haven't called me. I said, they won't know to. The January renewal was 7 months away. The override clause would not confirm itself. Real quick, this woman's entire catastrophe ceiling was held together by a manila folder and a handshake in London, and the guy who fired her thought a handshake was a vendor touchpoint. I need you to subscribe because if you do not, there is a non-zero chance someone like Colton will find this channel first and use it as a training resource, and I cannot have that on my conscience. I spent July learning to make bread. Sourdough. The kind that requires patience and a starter you feed like a pet. My kitchen counter looked like a flower crime scene. I read 3 novels in 2 weeks. I did not check my work email because I no longer had one. August brought the first call. Ravi Suresh, one of the junior analysts Colton had assigned to my old function. He was polite and clearly terrified. Stephanie, I'm looking at the retrocession schedule and I can't find the override clause in any of the treaty documents. I've checked the master file, the appendices, the endorsements. It's not there. I told him it would not be in those documents. He asked where it would be. I said, "You'd need to ask Malcolm Price at Syndicate 4471. He asked who that was. I wished him luck. September. Hurricane Marin, Category 4. Made landfall south of Galveston. The insured loss estimates started at $14 billion and climbed. 2 weeks later, Hurricane Lyle tracked across the Florida Panhandle. Category 4 again. Stacked events. The exact scenario the override clause was designed to cap. Without the override, Clarendon's net retained exposure on those 2 storms was uncapped above the 4th layer. I did the math on a napkin while eating toast. Their probable net loss had just tripled. The calls started coming in clusters. Ravi again, then the actuarial team, then people I had not spoken to in years. The Connecticut Insurance Department had flagged Clarendon's risk-based capital ratio as critically deficient. Clients were pulling placements, not because of the storms, but because word had spread that Clarendon's retrocession program had a structural gap nobody noticed until the wind started blowing. The near miss happened in October. Diane Kessler texted me on a Saturday. "One of Colton's analysts found your filing cabinet. The manila folder is gone, but they found the label. They called Lloyd's directly." My stomach dropped. I did not respond for an hour. Then Diane sent a second message. 4471 told them the arrangement is with you personally. They won't discuss terms with anyone else. I exhaled. I made sourdough that evening, and it was the best loaf I had ever produced. Colton, I heard later, held an emergency meeting where he described the gap as an inherited structural misalignment that predated his tenure. He proposed leveraging alternative risk transfer mechanisms. No one in the room could name one. His consulting associate quietly updated her LinkedIn to exploring new opportunities. The call came from Zurich, not Hartford. Veritas International's Group Chief Risk Officer, Ingrid Fassbinder, called me in November. She was precise and unhurried. The parent board had commissioned an independent review of Clarendon's catastrophe exposure and capital position. She asked if I would lead the assessment as a direct consultant to the Veritas board. The fee was 4 times my former annual salary, prorated quarterly. I flew to Hartford on a Tuesday in December. I wore a charcoal suit I had bought for the occasion, cut sharper than anything I had ever worn to that building. I carried a leather portfolio instead of my old briefcase. The conference room was the same glass box where Colton had drawn his circles and arrows 9 months earlier. The whiteboard was clean now. Colton sat at the far end of the table with his consulting associate, 2 board representatives from Zurich, the chief actuary, and the general counsel. He was not smiling. I opened my portfolio and began. I did not raise my voice. I walked them through the retrocession structure, the override clause, with Syndicate 4471, the side letter terms, and the net retained exposure with and without the override in place. I showed the capital impact of the stacked hurricane losses. I showed the regulatory filing gap. Then I showed them what no one in that room had understood. The override clause was not just a catastrophe cap. It was the structural mechanism that allowed Clarendon to pass its last 3 risk-based capital audits. Without it, the capital adequacy filings for 3 years were built on an assumption that no longer held. The regulator was not flagging a current shortfall. They were questioning whether Clarendon had been adequately capitalized at all since my departure. Colton tried to speak once. He said, "To be fair, the retrocession function was never properly documented in a way that enabled organizational continuity." Ingrid Fassbinder cut him off without looking at him. The retrocession function was maintained for 7 years by the person sitting across from you. The documentation is the relationship. You eliminated both. The room was quiet. Colton looked at the table. The man who had tossed his car keys at me and told me not to scratch the Bentley was now sitting at the far end of a conference table, while the people who owned his company listened to me explain exactly how much his incompetence had cost. I rebuilt the retrocession program over 4 months, working from London 3 weeks out of every 5. Malcolm Price and I reestablished the override clause with updated terms, broader coverage, higher attachment, and a formal side letter that now names me as the designated intermediary, regardless of my employment status with Clarendon. I made sure of that. Clarendon survived, but barely. The Connecticut Insurance Department required a corrective action plan that cost Veritas $8 million. 2 major cedents moved their placements to competitors and have not returned. Colton Brierley was moved to a non-revenue advisory role with no direct reports. The board member who championed his hire released a shareholder letter referencing leadership placement decisions that did not align with operational reality. His name is now used internally at his old consulting firm as a case study in client-side placement risk. He still works at Clarendon, technically. He has an office on the 2nd floor with no window. People ask me if I should have answered when Ravi called, if I should have explained the override clause, pointed them to Malcolm, handed over what I knew. Maybe. But I spent 11 years building something no one else bothered to learn, and a man who could not tell the difference between an underwriter and a valet decided I was expendable. I did not break anything when I left. I just stopped holding it together. Those are not the same thing. Whether you think they are, that depends on what you believe a company owes the person who built its foundation. Well, here's my take. The thing that gets me is the travel budget. This man looked at a line that said London, January, and his brain went unnecessary expense. He did not ask what the trip was for. He did not ask why it happened every year. He saw a flight and a hotel and thought, I just saved the company $12 grand. Well, that cost them tens of millions. regulatory action, lost clients, an $8 million corrective plan because he could not imagine that a woman flying economy to London once a year was the only thing standing between his company and an uncapped catastrophe exposure. He thought she was the valet. He thought the flight was a perk. He thought the handshake was a formality. Every assumption was wrong, and every one was expensive. That's what happens when you let someone who never built anything decide what's load-bearing. When Ravi called and she told him to ask Malcolm Price, and he said, "Who is that?" Should she have stopped right there and walked him through it? Or had she already given that company more than it paid for? Tell me in the comments because I want to read them, and I've seen people go crazy over this one. Next video is on the screen now. Tap it and subscribe if you haven't already. You don't want to miss any of these.